Hi, everybody. Happy Wednesday. I'm Gino Perotti. I am the founder, lead coach, educator for Right Brain Journeys. I'm also a lecturer at several colleges and universities, and I'm sharing this information with you in these LinkedIn Live learning sessions to help you become a more effective communicator. The ultimate purpose is to help you connect your head with your heart, and it's a journey, it's a right brain journey to be able to communicate from the inside out. So today's lesson is focused around public speaking, a topic here with my LinkedIn community, of course, that's very popular because when you effectively speak, then you are taking the information and the emotion from the inside, and then you're able to be influential, you're able to lead, you're able to build effective relationships when you are an effective public speaker using outward communication. Specifically, we're going to be focusing on the topic of gestures. Before I get into our agenda today, of course, welcome to everyone who's joining live, and then you may be catching this on the replay. I do these about once a month, and if you're joining live today, feel free to let us know in the comments where you are joining from. I'm joining from my apartment here in New York City. So on the agenda again for today are gestures and ones that we can use to make our public speaking more effective, meaning ways that we can use our gestures to help convey the message to the audience. Keeping in mind that when we speak, part of the message is verbal, so the words that we say, and part of the message is nonverbal, obviously the gestures part. So when those two are coordinated, you're helping to deliver the message two ways to your audience. Why is that important? Well, if you think about some effective commercial jingles, and I still think of the time that I was living in Orlando for many years, there is a car company there, and their phone number is 1-800 blah, 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 blah. And they say it 3 times throughout the commercial. And I still remember that phone number years later. I haven't lived in Orlando full time since 2016. So years later, I still remember that number through the power of repetition. So if you're delivering your message when you're speaking through your words, and then you're also reinforcing those words with effective nonverbals, such as gestures, you will be a more effective speaker because you're helping to deliver that information to your audience more than once and in more than one channel. So what do we mean by channels? Channels are routes, roads, ways of conveying information. And in terms of nonverbal communication, we have 10 different channels that we use to deliver our message. I've been teaching nonverbal communication as a course in college for over a decade now, and it's a fascinating topic. Some of those 10 channels include eye contact, gestures today, posture, the effects of touch, the effects of physical appearance, and obviously there are 5 more. So those are just a handful of the different channels that I've mentioned today. And we'll do some additional channels in the future, and I will talk about these in my monthly newsletter as well for those of you who are fascinated by nonverbal communication. So for today, again, we're getting into gestures specifically for public speaking. And the ones that I wanted to focus on, because there are a variety, but in terms of public speaking, the most helpful gestures I find can be categorized in 2 areas. They're going to be Illustrator gestures and punctuation gestures. Now, before we get into explaining what those are, and then I'll show you some ways that you can use effective ones for public speaking, let me back up for just a minute and explain that nonverbal communication as a whole, I said that there are 10 channels. As a whole, it can be broken down into 2 large categories. And then I gave you categories of gestures under one of the categories. So we're backing it up for just a moment here. 2 large categories. You can either have speech independent gestures, and these are movements you can make that would be no words needed. You can use your hands to make certain signs, and the audience will know what that is. There is a caveat to that, though, which means that just like not all words mean the same thing, therefore, I was going to give you an example of this is US English versus Australian English. US English, you know, the little bag that you clip around your waist, it's called a fanny pack in the United States. I discovered years ago when I was studying abroad in Italy and spending time with some Australian students that I called it a fanny pack, and they were horrified because apparently in Australian English, the word fanny is profane. So they do not call it that. They call it a bum bag. So just like in language, the words itself, it doesn't translate automatically across cultures. Same thing with our hand movements. So I'll give you a couple examples here as well. And these can mean different things in different cultures. So in the United States and other cultures in the world, doing this sign means okay. It's a gesture that can be decoded in our culture, and people know exactly what that means. Okay. But that same exact hand movement in other cultures, it can also be profane. It can mean you're worth zero. It can indicate money. So my caveat to the speech independent gestures are that you don't need words, but it is very much dependent on the culture of the people seeing it as to how they decode it. So we're going to do that in another LinkedIn Live because that's huge. Instead, we're going to focus on that second category. So again, nonverbal communication can either be speech dependent, like the OK sign, or it can be speech independent, which is the direction that we're going to drill down into and give you some specifics for this category. So speech dependent, then, these gestures must have words for it to make sense. So if I'm just pointing in this direction and not saying anything, it's not giving you enough information. What am I pointing to? The door, the bathroom, the person over there. So I have to have some kind of words to accompany it in order for that to make sense. So that's where we're going to spend our time. And now that we're in that category of speech dependent, here are the two that we want to use for public speaking in our lesson today. If you use these, they'll help you become a more effective speaker. The first one is called an Illustrator gesture. And just like you would illustrate a drawing, if you use Illustrator gestures, you're using your hand movements to help draw a picture to make something more certain and more clear. So the example that I would have, I use this from my time again living in Orlando. I used to teach for the University of Central Florida, so UCF. And near UCF on University Boulevard, there was a pizzeria, might still be there, called Lazy Moon Pizza. It was inexpensive and the pizza was huge, gigantic. If you got like an entire round pizza, huge. Well, the word huge is subjective because now that I live in New York City and I walk by the pizza by the slice places, that's actually the biggest pizza I've ever seen. Those entire pizza pies are even larger than the ones that I saw at Lazy Moon Pizza in Orlando. So huge is subjective. It's relative to the person and their experience of what huge means. So if I help illustrate this more abstract word huge, more subjective word, then I help the audience gain a better understanding. So Lazy Moon Pizza is huge. And I'm not joking. Like the round pizza pie was like this. It was like a cover to a manhole. It was humongous. If you use gestures to illustrate, it'll make these abstract concepts more clear for your audience, which obviously is the entire point. Okay, so the first one in terms of gestures is called Illustrator. The second one that I want to share with you is called punctuation gestures. And punctuation gestures serve as punctuation. So commas, exclamation points, question marks, period. My question becomes for you just thinking about this, what gestures could you use to indicate any of those punctuation marks? How would you indicate a question mark, for example? See, I just asked you a question, for example, and I did it naturally. I didn't even try to plan that one. The way that we use, at least in Western culture in the United States, to indicate a question mark would say, how do you use this punctuation? And you put your palms up. Do you know the answer to this question? I don't know. What's the answer? So putting our hands up is almost like getting ready to receive the information from the other person. It becomes an offering. Please help me out. So if you want to ask a question, say, what do you all think? Hand up, maybe shrug your shoulder. Shoulder is more posture. It's called kinesics, which is another channel, but the palm up specifically is a gesture. So that can help indicate a question mark. How would you indicate a comma? And maybe you have a different way than me, which is fine, as long as it is understood, kind of like that OK symbol. As long as it's understood by the large majority of the people that you're speaking to, then it will be an effective gesture. So for me, the way that I would use a comma, so for example, I used to be a gymnast and coach gymnastics for many years. So if we're going to talk about three categories of tumbling: front tumbling, back tumbling, and side tumbling. So if I was writing that on a piece of paper, I would say front tumbling, comma, back tumbling, comma, and side tumbling. So how do I indicate those commas verbally? I would do it with chopping movements. And visually, it's placing these into buckets for the audience. So we have front tumbling, back tumbling, and side tumbling. So these motions of chopping with my hands, where the commas would be on the paper, visually give the audience a, um, a visual aid to help them realize I'm talking about three separate things. I'm almost putting them into three different boxes with my hands. And that is taking the place of commas. How about punctuation marks, like exclamation points? Chopping your hand, not in a mad way unless you are angry, but you say, I am so excited. This motion can be an exclamation point, because an exclamation point, when you say it, when a sentence ends with an exclamation point, there's some type of really strong power. It's much more emotionally charged than a period at the end of a sentence. So this level of energy coming in, or just even a clapping motion, or, oh my gosh, hands going up, and then your face lightening up too, but the face is nonverbal as well. So that's another channel. But the hands getting larger and displaying more energy would be a good way to indicate an exclamation point. So that's mentioned before we move into the next area. So we talked about overall speech dependent gestures. Next, we're going to be talking about frames of these gestures. So incorporating our body in relation to these gestures. Before I do that, I do want to mention, since there are 10 different channels of nonverbal communication, we break these down into 10 separate areas so we can really study what they're about. But keep in mind, of course, it all is in a context, meaning we rarely do just gestures by themselves. We rarely do just body movements by itself or eye contact by itself. It becomes difficult to judge the effectiveness of just gestures, in other words, because other things are going on at the same time with it. And that's just the other nonverbal things. Then you have cultural things you got to bring in too. It starts to get really complex, which is why this is an entire field of study. So the area that I do want to move into, and this will be what we end with on the lesson today, is inward and outward frames of gestures. And so what I mean by this is that frame would be from your shoulders in or your shoulders out. And that's how I'm talking about frame to describe these things. So inward gestures happen from your frame in. These are good gestures for something like this, speaking on camera, especially when you get even closer up and you're zooming in. These don't always look natural if you're going to do just inward gestures in person, because you're not taking up enough physical space. But on camera, you only have certain space to work with. So if I talk about this and I'm gesturing and my hands are going out of range, it's like my microphone being on mute. You're missing the visual communication happening with these gestures. So therefore, when we do broadcasting that's more inward because of the camera frame, then you want to keep your gestures here. Quick color tip for this as well. Consider this color of your skin and the color of your shirt that you're wearing, and make sure they have enough contrast. So my shirt is enough contrast with my own skin color that when my hands are here, you can see them clearly. It's like verbally articulating your words. I have a really nice shirt that I like quite a bit. It's like a peachy pinky color. It's a polo shirt. I don't wear that one too much for public speaking though, because it's not enough contrast with my skin color and the wall behind me, so that I kind of disappear. It's harder to see those things. So that's something to consider when you're doing inward gestures. Make sure the contrast with what you're wearing is enough that people can clearly see your hands, like I'm wearing today. So inward gestures, they don't make you appear larger, and that's a good thing since you want to fit in this frame. Also, if someone's standing behind you, they wouldn't be able to see the gestures because it's happening, within the forward frame of your body. Second set of gestures as to where you can do things like punctuation gestures and where you could do things like exclamation points or question marks would also be outward then. Outward gestures when you're speaking in person, if you're speaking on stage, for example, or in front of the room at a meeting and you're standing up, yes, it's natural that you're going to have a mix of some inward gestures too, because not everything is grand and big. So you will talk a little bit more in your inward frame. But it is important, at least in Western culture, specifically the United States, where I teach and where I've studied, to use larger gestures. And these larger ones I'm referring to as outward, meaning from our shoulders extending past our body. And the theory behind this goes to Amy Cuddy's power posing research, which is very interesting. A quick note, other scholars have had difficulty replicating her findings, which brings into question whether her results were truly found from the power pose or whether they were due to some other variable that she didn't measure and capture. But that's for my science people out there. But the findings are still interesting. Anyway, what Cuddy was talking about in her Power Pose TED Talk, which is an excellent TED Talk if you want to Google it, was that when we make these larger postures and we hold them for at least 2 minutes, if I'm remembering the time correctly, that we start to feel more strong and dominant and confident, that our testosterone increases in our body. So the appearance of getting bigger in the animal world is a way to also appear more confident and stronger, which can help defend yourself. I'm just trying to think of the word I wanted to say. Defend yourself, but it's also a way to attract people. Think about birds in their mating calls, and they're getting larger because they're trying to attract. I'm strong, I can protect, follow me, I can lead, I know the way. So if you're giving these larger gestures, it can help send those signals visually to people. At least that's the theory. And then the other theory is, since many people feel nervous with public speaking, it's generally the number one phobia in the United States. This can help boost your cortisol, because if you're speaking for a couple minutes and you're doing mostly large gestures, it'll boost your testosterone. I'm sorry I said that wrong. It'll decrease your cortisol, which is your stress hormone, and it should, we theorize, increase your testosterone. And that's theorizing off of Cuddy's research with power posing. Overall, you're taking up more space. And if you're in a large room like an auditorium and you're speaking on stage, being larger means that you're going to be more visible to the people who are further away. So there are definite positives to using outward gestures. So the basic conclusion for frames of reference for your gestures: if you're speaking on camera, use inward ones. Consider the color contrast between the color of your hands and the color of your attire so that we can clearly see your gestures. And then if you're speaking in person, you're going to have a mix. You're going to do more larger ones, outward frames of gestures. And of course, you'll speak sometimes here with your smaller gestures within your inward frame. Okay, the last thing I want to mention are technically not gestures. These are more on the touching behaviors, which is a channel in nonverbal communication. But since they involve the hands, I often talk about them in the category of gestures. So this is what I'm going to end with you today. So it's a bonus tip. These are ones that you want to avoid. We talked about our inward and outward frames of gestures as something to do. We talked about your speech dependent gestures, Illustrator gestures, and punctuation gestures as things you want to do to be a more effective speaker. Now these avoiding self and object adapters means do not do these. And it's helpful to record yourself and get feedback from a coach to be able to see what these are if you do these, because you do want to avoid it. These are reducing your credibility. So we use adapters in order to calm ourselves down. Typically, people do these when they're feeling nervous or anxious. And the real danger in it is that if people see you doing these, it can start to trigger that nervous feeling within them. Quick example of how I talk about this concept of emotional contagion is the movie Bridesmaids from 2011. Not sure if you've ever seen that movie, but it was, I thought, hysterically funny. There was a scene where the two characters were talking at a country club doing a speech for the engagement party of the bride and the groom. And these two ladies were competing for the best friend position with the bride. So they kept one-upping each other, or trying to one-up each other with their speech. And in that moment, it was meant to be awkward, and the acting was so good and their facial expressions were so effective that I remember sitting in the seat in the movie theater and just feeling so awkward and uncomfortable. I actually was like shrinking back because they were making me feel that. They were very effective. That same idea is the idea that I'm talking about here with your adapter gestures, that if you're feeling super uncomfortable when you're speaking and you're doing these adapters, then you may make your audience feel uncomfortable, trigger that anxious feeling in them, which would not help them receive the message. So what are these things? Again, we use these as a way to calm ourselves down, and we often mimic the calming touch of another person, but we do it to ourselves. So maybe you hold your arm and you're rubbing your arm. Maybe you keep playing with your hair. You can also, those are called self adapters. You can also do object adapters. Maybe you're wearing a bracelet and you spin that bracelet on your hand. You play with your wedding band, your ring, something like that. For some people, they may have an object like a pen that they hold on to for dear life, and they're twirling this pen or they're clicking the pen. Obviously, the noise of that would be very distracting, but even the twirling can be distracting. So you want to make your gestures be things that enhance the message, not detract. Goes back to what I mentioned in the very beginning, that when we use our gestures effectively, they complement the words. And then you're delivering the message in two ways. It's repetitious, two different ways to the audience. Some people may be more receptive verbally, others may be more receptive visually. So you're playing to both sides of those when you use your words and your gestures in sync. Okay, so what did we cover today? We covered gestures, specifically speech-dependent gestures. We gave you tips for Illustrator gestures. That was the pizza example, and using your hands to show how huge the pizza is. So you actually illustrate more what a subjective or abstract word is. We talked about punctuation gestures. I gave you examples for question. You could put your hands up. I don't know. What do you think? You could do commas and chopping movements. You could do an exclamation point and do a fist movement like that. And then we talked about frames of gestures. We talked about inward frame, so moving your hands from your shoulders in, or using larger outward gestures from your shoulders out. And then finally, I gave you a bonus tip of things to avoid, these body movements called adapters. We want to avoid the self adapter, which is when you may touch yourself, like rubbing your arm, or object adapters, twirling your bracelet, spinning your ring. Remember, avoid these because not only can they show the audience that you're nervous, which can reduce your credibility, potentially it could even trigger that emotion in them, which will make them less likely to receive the message because it's harder to listen. All right, thank you so much for joining me today. How can you improve your gestures? Well, record yourself practicing would be the one thing. Make sure that you're seeing the gestures that you use. I also recommend, and I do this with my clients, that we write an outline more than a script, but we write an outline with the key things that you want to deliver during your speech. And then we plan certain areas, which I use a highlighter. We highlight certain words where we plan to do a certain type of gesture, like an Illustrator or a punctuation gesture. And that way you are thinking ahead of time and starting to plan a strategy around the message that you want to deliver to the audience and making sure that you're getting these things in. Watching it then will also help you become aware of any adapters that you might have. So record yourself practicing this and then watch for these adapters. The final thing is I invite you to work with me. I work with clients often on public speaking. It comes from writing a message and builds all the way up into the delivery of it. So we work, of course, on gestures. We also work on vocalics, which is another channel of nonverbal communication. How do you say with the sound of your voice what you want to say in a way that is appropriate for the message? It has the right emotional tone, and it helps the audience feel what you need them to feel, which is important because we know that emotion is actually what's driving behavior. So it's not just the words, but it's how those words make people feel. And your voice, as well as gestures and the other 8 channels of nonverbal, since there are 10, those help create that emotional tone to the speech. So I invite you to work with me. You can do that by going to Right Brain Journeys. I've been playing around here with a QR code, so you may see a QR code. I hope it's showing. If not, I'll have to figure that out for the next time. But of course, you can just Google Right Brain Journeys or connect with me here on LinkedIn if you're viewing this on the platform. Send me a message. I'd love to reach out and have a conversation with you as well. You can also follow along with my lessons. I have a monthly LinkedIn newsletter. It's called Conscious Communication. It's published within the first 10 days of the month. So this topic for today will be all written out and scripted into the newsletter for April. And again, just go to my website or follow me here on LinkedIn, and you'll see up in my featured section of my profile the link to subscribe to the Conscious Communication newsletter. It'll go straight to your inbox and your email for whichever email address you have registered for LinkedIn. Anything else? Anything else? I invite you to join my LinkedIn group, Communication and Public Speaking Mentorship Community for coaches, influencers, and entrepreneurs as well. Thanks so much for joining. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. I'll wait just another moment, and then we'll officially conclude our lesson for today, and I will see you next month. Good. I'll wait just another moment here to see if anyone drops in any questions. All right. That looks like we're good to go. Have a wonderful week. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.